Wow, that was very warm. I very much appreciate that. As I was saying a minute ago, my usual talk is about 35 minutes and says, here's what's been going on in construction, here's what's happening with materials cost, labor availability, and so forth. I'll be glad to send folks my slides on that or sign you up for the Data Digest, my weekly one-page summary of economic news. But I decided, in the spirit of giving a TED-type talk, I would try to describe what might happen in 20 years in 19 minutes. And for that, I'd really appreciate your feedback afterwards as to what your own ideas are, because economists have no better vision of the future than anybody else. And so you're certainly the expert on this. I'm just supposed to be the instigator of whether it makes any sense to you. To get perspective on that, I've actually had a very unusual set of stimuli, shall we say. 3 days ago, I was in Panama. In fact, I spent 4 days with the New York State chapter of AGC, getting to see the Panama Canal from a variety of perspectives. First, we looked at the Miraflores locks on the Pacific side, which strangely enough is east of the Atlantic end of the Panama. I'm still confused by that. But we also saw a museum on the history of digging the canal, and I was reading a book called The Darkest Jungle, fascinating account of a little-known Navy expedition in 1854 to try to find a different route through the Darien jungle that ended disastrously. But then we took a train ride the length of the canal, and the third day we actually sailed through the canal. And at the end of the train ride, we saw the locks that are being built to widen and deepen and lengthen the canal. And then from there, I went to Houston, and I talked to the Houston chapter of AGC yesterday morning. I got into Seattle with some spare time for once, and I went to the Museum of History and Innovation and learned a lot about Seattle's history and its continuing trend of being an innovator and really shaking up the world. And so those three looks at the past, the present of what is an economy in great transition in Houston, and how Seattle and all of Washington State is really helping to invent the future, has helped give me some ideas about where the economy and the construction industry may be going nationally and here in the Northwest, and specifically in the Puget Sound area. U.S. population is still growing, and in fact we still have more births than deaths, but that is in transition very strongly. The population growth rate has slowed down, partly because the birth rate has slowed down, but more so because we are seeing fewer net immigrants. We actually are having more people from Mexico leave this country and go back to Mexico than are coming over the border. Instead, we're getting more immigrants, particularly here in Seattle and throughout the Northwest, from Asia and somewhat from other parts of Latin America. But the composition of immigration is changing again, just as it changed many times over Seattle's history, where at one point you had immense immigration from China and then actually kicked out the Chinese in a very violent way. And I think 20 years from now, there's an open question. I think there's little question that we will continue to have a very low birth rate. Perhaps it will decline even more. It's not going to get back up to the so-called replacement level, just as in all developed countries, it has been declining. In fact, developing countries also, although they still have relatively high birth rates. But much of the world, population is actually declining now. And in the U.S. in 20 years, I think the only chance that it will continue to be growing is if we are allowing immigration. And my crystal ball doesn't tell me which way we're going to go on that. But I think it's extremely important here in Washington, where at the moment your growth rate is twice that of the country as a whole, and so you're getting many opportunities for construction, much demand for construction that you don't have elsewhere. Will we choke off that necessary source of ideas of innovation, of labor supply for an industry like construction that is desperately seeking more workers? or are we going to put ourselves into artificial decline by closing those borders? So that's one thing that I think very much hangs in the balance about what the U.S. will look like in 20 years. I'm also very conscious about infrastructure. The Panama Canal is still functioning with the original locks, although they no longer have mechanical gears to open them. It's hydraulic, but nevertheless, 102 years, those locks have continued to work. The Panama Canal only shut down for 4 periods in all of that time, generally for a few hours, and not because of problems with the locks. One time was because of the U.S. invasion that overthrew Noriega, and in fact, they showed us the, quote, 5-star hotel where he still lives at age 79. But at any rate, do we have the will, the technology to produce such durable infrastructure today? And here in the Puget Sound area, I know that that technology has been put to the test in the most severe way. That tunnel boring machinery looked like a way of greatly reducing the time and cost to produce tunnels, something you certainly need in this very mountainous terrain. And instead, we've had major problems. That doesn't mean that the technology is a failure, but we have a lot to learn. And will we be able to adapt and to adopt the newer technology? Certainly in other areas, we see that Northwest is a world leader and is helping to shake up the ways that we do business, for better and for worse. You have one of the leading retailers in the country, and they are finding people no longer want to go to department stores to buy stuff. Instead, they want to buy stuff through that other company that sprang up here and is now dominating e-commerce. How are those trends going to evolve? What do they mean for construction? Certainly contractors who made their business putting up big box stores or strip shopping malls, shopping centers, they've had to adapt or die. And I think that's a message that we're seeing across the economy. Today we got a report that real gross domestic product, that broadest measure of U.S. production net of inflation, crept ahead at only 0.7% in the last quarter. Does that mean that we're about to go into decline? I hear regularly from people who say, oh, the expansion has lasted longer than the average 5 years or whatever it was, so surely we're about to hit a recession. Well, there's no such thing as a natural lifespan for economic expansion. I think that it's quite possible that 20 years from now we'll look back and say, wow, we had 26 years of growth and we're still going. But it's also possible that we'll have been through 4 recessions by then. I think one thing that's certain is that construction is going to continue to have its ups and downs, that we have had good growth in both residential and non-residential construction in the last 2 years. And from everything I see, 2016 will continue to be a year of moderate growth, say high single-digit growth in construction spending. Not quite the 10 to 12% that I think we had in 2015 or the 10% that the industry had in 2014, but still very positive in 2016, probably a little slower in 2017, but still positive. Beyond that, my crystal ball clouds over, and I don't have a prediction how 2018 will go, but fortunately today I'm supposed to talk about 2036. And what I see is that we will have still demand for housing, but I think a much higher share than we've seen in the past is going to be multifamily. You've already seen that happening here in Seattle itself and somewhat in the suburban areas, that more people are either choosing to live in rental housing, in high-rise housing in particular, or they're being forced to because they have high student debt or other credit impairments, they're not qualifying for a mortgage. Well, eventually those things will stabilize. The people who are living in single-family homes at my age and older eventually will say, this is too much house to keep up, and maybe we'll want to swap for that apartment that the millennial who has a family and is finally ready to get some land around them and a house for the kids to play in, that they'll want to trade with us. But don't assume that it's going to be an even exchange. I think that 20 years from now, we are going to see more cities having a higher population, a higher density, and many suburbs that had been the place to go to, frankly, falling behind. I'm a D.C. native, that supposedly rare creature. Grew up in the other Washington, as I often hear it called out here, and I saw the population decline for 50 years. It hit its peak right after World War II, declined until the beginning of last decade, and now it may well get back past its previous peak. And that's happening in cities all over the country, that at least certain neighborhoods are attracting residents and becoming denser than they have been in a long time. And I think that's a trend that will last for 20 years. On non-residential construction, let me take the public side of that. We built a fantastic interstate highway system, and we've let it decline over the last 30 years because we're not willing to elect members of Congress who have the courage to say, we need more taxes to pay for this, or nor are we willing to pay tolls ourselves on most of the roads that we use, or pay congestion pricing. We're not even willing to say, we ought to be paying by the mile. Down the road in Oregon, they're trying that out. In California, they're looking for volunteers to test out a pay-by-the-mile system. But those are pretty tentative steps. I wrote my master's thesis more than 40 years ago about the first efforts at congestion pricing that had already taken place in Hong Kong and Singapore. Now they have that in London, they have it in certain other areas, but we still don't have it in the US. I'll be bold and say 20 years from now, we'll finally be able and willing to adopt this brilliant new idea that was written about in the 1950s. But I'm not sure that we will be applying it at a high enough rate to pay for what I'm afraid will be our still more congested and more deteriorating highway infrastructure. Nor will we be supporting transit or rail at a level that will make them effective alternatives. While in general I'm an incurable optimist, when it comes to looking at infrastructure, I'm afraid 20 years from now we're just getting a foretaste now of roads that are congested not just during so-called rush hour, but 8 or 10 hours a day may be the norm for more of our highways, and more examples of water and water treatment systems breaking down. Hopefully not as disastrously as in Flint, Michigan, but I think we are going to have more cases where people can't rely on the municipal or state provided infrastructure that we've been fortunate enough to grow up with, raise our kids with, that we knew was safe and helpful. Now, on the more positive side, I think that the public sector is bit by bit getting more flexible, shall we say, maybe more innovative in its approach to education. In D.C., 45% of the people in public school go to public charter schools. They're not all better than the traditional public schools, but clearly the parents now welcome having a choice, and public charter schools do get shut down either because the parents abandon them or the public charter school board says you're not providing an effective education. That's something we don't see with traditional public schools, and I think increasingly we will see the public demand and get more choice and a generally better, more suitable level of education for children in the K through 12 areas. What is the implication for construction? Well, those schools, largely in D.C. and in other cities where they're spreading, are opening up in either formerly closed public school buildings or in other types of structures that already existed. So we're no longer seeing the correspondence between growth of population or movement of population with that growth to ever further out suburbs and therefore new schools. Even where population is growing, as it has dramatically in D.C., we grew faster than any state in 2011 and have been among the top 10 in each of the past 4 years, but we're not building new schools. So contractors who have concentrated on school construction are not going to see the same level of growth as other areas. At the higher ed level, we're also seeing big changes. university and college enrollment has actually declined for 3 years in a row. And we're not about to have another baby boom wave move into college. More students, in fact, more high school leavers, I think, will be choosing careers that don't require college, or that they will get that higher education through massive open online courses or other kinds of internet-type experiences, and they won't be filling up classrooms and dormitories. State universities have been cut loose, I think, on a permanent basis by their legislatures from the level of funding that they got from construction. And instead, they are turning more to foundations, to alumni, to corporations, to joint ventures, somewhat for building on campus. But we've also seen dormitories replaced by purpose-built student apartments off campus, privately owned. And so this is an example of how what had previously been a niche in public construction is turning into something done by the private sector. And once again, contractors are going to have to adapt. Now, I do think that eventually college enrollments will be rising, simply because there is a huge generation of millennials who, while they have put off having children and won't have the 2.1 kids needed to keep population from shrinking without immigration, I think, yes, we will eventually see more kids in college within 20 years, and so there will be some expansion. But many smaller colleges that rely mainly on enrollment from nearby areas, they will be closing their doors. And so I think, again, contractors will have to really adapt to changing circumstances. Manufacturing has come back in a big way and now is starting to decline again. And I think we can expect to see waves of manufacturing as new industries come along, new techniques. But in general, the trend is for manufacturing to be a much smaller part of the economy. People are buying less stuff, particularly if they live in an apartment, if they're renting. They're not going out to buy yard and garden stuff. They don't have as much square footage as in a house. The appliances are bought by the developer, the landlord, investor, rather than the individual. So that has implications not just for retail, but for the entire distribution chain. Warehouse had been a big construction niche until now, but Amazon and its competitors have pretty much built out what they need for the moment. And so neither traditional retailers nor internet retailers are going to be demanding as much warehouse space, and back up the chain to manufacturing. Now, the Northwest, I think, has great opportunities here in terms of building trade connections with the rest of the world. You've long emphasized that, and I think that Asian trade will come back. You have terrific ports. My visit to the Panama Canal showed me that you face big competition, but you do have big advantages here. And with your population growth, I think you will continue to outstrip the rest of the country in demand for construction of many types. But my message ultimately is construction has to be nimble. You have to look ahead 20 years. Don't rely on an economist or a so-called futurist to tell you what the future will be like. Use your own instincts, trust them, and good luck. Thank you.